Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Aaron Newcomb joins me. We're going to be talking about Cockpit, a way to manage your Linux system right from the web browser. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Aaron Newcomb. Episode 440, recorded June 28th, 2017. Cockpit. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects you may be using every day, totally unaware of it, projects you might want to download right after this show and play with. I think today's going to be one of those. Welcome back, Aaron Newcomb, to the show.
Oh, hello, Randall.
Yeah, sorry. That was an abrupt transition. I was thinking, hey, it's going to be great because Aaron's coming back as a co-host, and then I was going to give you sort of a longer lead in, and then all of a sudden I just said, no, Aaron, you're on the show.
No, I was just joking. I'm getting ready. I'm trying to cool down my coffee so I can chug it down. No, it's great. It's good to be back on, Randall. It's been a while.
I know. And a part of that, of course, was that you started a new job and they just started having meetings every Tuesday morning, and that kind of interfered entirely with being on this show. So you're speaking to us from somewhere, was it Oakland? No, where are you at?
No, downtown San Francisco. So I work at a company called New Relic. Okay. So we're right down here on Spear Street in the middle of the action, so to speak. And yeah, great company to work for. And luckily, now we've moved the show to Wednesday, so I can join again. Yes. It's awesome.
Yes, and I have one more day to recover from the weekend in terms of nobody giving me their information and stuff. I now have two weekdays to yell at people to say, hey, I really need that last little piece of information, like your Skype handle or whatever. It's time to get that all in. And I'm back in my home in Beaverton, Oregon, with a really plain backdrop here, and hopefully a much better net connection than last week. I'm using the very same modem, but I tell you, it's when it's the middle of the day and everybody's on their Sprint phone at the same time, and this one doesn't do so well. But early in the morning, and probably it's built out better in Beaverton in terms of data and everything. So anyway, I'm back in Beaverton and I'm going to be here for this show. Obviously, what am I saying? That doesn't make any sense. What is this show? It's probably the next thing I should be talking about, which is we're going to be talking about Cockpit. Steph Walter, one of the project leads, is going to be joining us in a few minutes to talk about this package. Actually, to put it simply, I've been calling it sort of WebMin on steroids, but I think that's doing a bit of disjustice to some of the goals of what Cockpit is actually doing. It's basically a graphical interface using a web browser to be able to administer your Linux system from top to bottom, and getting access to everything that you might have to edit with a configuration file or with command line utilities to change those files or to change the state of things. And what I found remarkable about this so far is that one of their goals is that they don't have any of their own state that's somewhere locked up inside Cockpit. Because I know, for example, that if I recall correctly, like WebMin and other tools like this, they tend to have their own sort of idea of the world, and then they go out and they tell the system when you're changing that database to actually change the real actions that update the system. But according to the documentation I've seen so far on Cockpit, it can be used back and forth. You could be sitting there with a terminal window open, typing commands, and then go over to the Cockpit window, and there it is, already changed within a couple of seconds in both directions. Even to the point where they don't even have their own user base. You simply log in with your root credentials or with your ability to sudo credentials, and it will do all the right things behind the scenes to validate you using the system utilities rather than having its own idea of a separate added user and things like that. So that's what I know about this so far. Aaron, have you skimmed this over a little bit, and am I leaving anything out that you thought was interesting so far?
No, you did a great job there. I'm very impressed with how much you already know about it. My kind of curiosity with it is how it relates to Project Atomic. We had Josh Berkus on, I don't know when that was, 3 or 4 months ago, to talk about Project Atomic. And I know that, I don't know if this is a Red Hat official project or not. I know that Steph works at Red Hat, so I'm kind of curious about what Red Hat's involvement in this is and how it relates to Project Atomic, which is, their kind of a container OS, or an OS for containers containers. It's actually more than that, but to simplify it down, that's what it is. So I'm kind of curious how this plugs into that, whether they're going to be using it for that soon. Does it have any sort of connection with managing or administrating Docker environments as well? So I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit more about what this is actually designed to, what problem this is trying to solve.
Well, we can sit back and forth and go, well, let's see, what did I get from the website? But I tell you what, I think we should probably be talking to the authority on this. So let's go ahead and bring him on. Steph Walter, welcome to the show.
Hey, guys. It's good to be on.
And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm here in Germany. I typically work with a team all over the world. I work remote. But yeah, I'm at Red Hat. We have a really fun team. In fact, we're all here in Karlsruhe in Germany, right on the French border, for a Hackfest right now. And today, coincidentally, we were talking about some of the same things you brought up, Randall, about, nope, we're not going to store state. We're not going to try and invent new things for the server, but we're going to expose them as is and make them better. So that's pretty cool to hear. You were spot on with your description, I would say. And
well, that means I give you an A+ for your elevator pitch on the website. And that's always a good test, just to see how well I can sort of describe it. But let's step back a bit. I mean, let's hear it right from you, because you've been directly involved. Give us a 30,000-foot view. What problem is Cockpit solving?
So I'm a usability guy, and I feel like we're pretty far away from the Star Trek kind of, on screen or computer, go ahead and do this. These kind of very usable abilities where machines actually help us rather than complicate our lives. We see strides in that area, but it's not enough, especially in the area of Linux. So what I really wanted to help with was disentangle a lot of the complexity. And so that's what drew me to Cockpit in the first place. But that wasn't enough. What really drew me in was the fact that we were able to make a real Linux session in a web browser, where from the web browser, from the JavaScript, running in your browser, you interact with the system as if it was a shell script, as easy as a shell script, connecting and implementing pieces of the UI, talking with the system really intimately and closely. And because Linux has grown more integrated over the last few years, with projects like systemd, with projects like Docker, which own part of the system. They take ownership of that part of the system. They say, nope, there's 1,000 ways to do containers, but here's one that's going to work, and we're claiming it. And it's the same with systemd. There's 1,000 ways to write, init scripts and so on, but here's the way that we're going to go do this. And by integrating those pieces, they make a project like Cockpit be able to expose that and make it feel very native to the system without having this confusing mid-tier that just gets in the way, like projects like Webmin or cPanel do. So that's what got me excited.
Yeah, and what am I looking at when I'm trying to use this? Am I seeing a series of screens? Am I seeing the LCARS format? Because I know you like Star Trek, apparently. So, or is it? What am I looking at?
So once you log into Cockpit, you're really looking at a task switcher on the left-hand side with various tasks. It looks like a menu. It looks like a typical web menu. And then the screens that you're looking at. So for example, if you dive into the Docker screen for containers, or you go to the storage screen that lets you format your disks or configure your network, those are really applications. We make them full screen so they look really handy and easy to use. But under the covers, those are really separate applications running in your browser, single-page web apps running in your browser, that each have access to the system with your credentials. So you're logged in, it starts a session as you on the system, and then these apps run in that session. On the system, there's very little running except for a transport that lets these apps talk to the pieces of the system, talk to Unix sockets, open files, talk to dbus APIs, REST APIs, execute the tools, all the same tasks you would do if you were logged in from a SH terminal. And all the actual logic that knows about storage or networking or how to display these things or what kind of options are available, that's in the browser. So it's actually extremely lightweight on the server. When you're not using it, nothing is running. Literally nothing is running. It starts on demand. So I think we did a really good job of this. It's tiny as well. It's the total size is like, I think 2.5 megabytes installed. And a lot of that is translations and things like that. So yeah, take a look. So I encourage anyone to take a look at it. And I think you'll come away liking what you see.
Well, how did this project get started?
So this actually was a project that started at Red Hat around 2011. We got feedback from customers that it was hard to get started with Linux. There's a big barrier to entry. Once you're past that, then you can basically create whatever you want. And I like to talk about this as if you're forced to build your own vehicle with Linux traditionally, but then you have a vehicle that suits your needs exactly. So, and yet a lot of people come to this and they think, what if I just want to drive it? What if I just want to get in and drive? And then maybe from there get more involved in how it works and what I can swap out and how I can customize this and make it suited to my needs. And that first step is missing. So the first goal of Cockpit is make it really easy for a new audience to jump in and get acquainted and outgrow Cockpit when they're ready for it. Remove the barrier to entry for Linux servers and systems.
So this is like training wheels, but you still need to learn how to pedal the bicycle and still need to learn how to turn the steering wheel ultimately, or you're not going anywhere.
Right. And that goes to the second goal. We have these two very solid goals. First one, remove the barrier to entry. And the second one is make complicated operations straightforward and simple. Let's say you wanted to make a network bond on your Linux system. There's lots of ways to do that. Probably the first thing you do is you go and read a blog post about it. In fact, you probably read several and figure out which blog post applies to your Linux system, which documentation, how to make sure that bond doesn't go away, network bond doesn't go away when you reboot, and so on and down the line. Read some manual pages, figure out the commands. There's a lot of tasks there. Now, you probably want to do something else. You could. Any expert, anyone who's used Linux for a while can do these tasks. They do routinely, but it takes a lot of time. So being able to just get to what you're doing, configure the bond with a few clicks, be done, and have that be actually implemented in the way you would, in the right way, the way that you would want to do it on the system anyway, and move on. And next time you can figure out how to, if you need to figure out how to do it, we're not taking that away from you. But even for people who routinely use Linux, beyond training wheels, people find this massively useful. Or if you bring up Kubernetes, the ability to just dive in through the web GUI, through the Cockpit GUI, into any container's log or shell and see what process is mucking around in that container, or change your LVM partitions without having to relearn all the commands every time, and so on. These kinds of things allow even those of us who are far beyond training wheels to kind of zero in on the tasks we care about and let the system worry about the other stuff.
So, Steph, what does this work with right now? Is it only available on Red Hat, for example? I mean, that would be the obvious one. Or can I run it on my Debian-based systems as well? Because, I mean, they all have, in terms of administration, for sure, they all have different requirements, slightly different ways of configuring different things. So where does this run right now?
That's a really great question. So it does run on Debian and Ubuntu. It runs on, as you mentioned earlier, Atomic. It runs on Fedora, RHEL, CentOS. There's packages for SUSE and Arch. And if you go to cockpitproject.org, that URL that you see at the bottom of the screen, there's a running link and all of the steps. There's like 3 steps for each of these. It's really simple to get started on any of them. And I think, though, for Debian, we're in one of the experimental. It takes a while to get into the actual release. But, it's there. And I think it's in backports, too. So, and it's in the stable Ubuntu, the latest Ubuntu. So it's not just Red Hat specific. But your second
great.
part of
so I can just do like an apt-get. Well, I'm going to break it and then I'm going to let you finish the second question.
Yeah.
So for Debian-based systems or Ubuntu-based systems, I can just do a sudo apt-get install Cockpit and it'll install for me? Oh, that's perfect. Right. Okay, nice. Now,
listed on port 9090, which is the WebSM port, Web System Manager port, I think it's called. It's a standard port that not many people use, but easy to remember, 9090. But yes, to the second part of your question, you're right. All these Linuxes are different. And Cockpit is pure UI. Randall touched on this earlier. We don't have a mid-tier where we store data. We leave the logic and data storage to the system itself. So that means you can use command line tools to interact with it just as easily at the same time as Cockpit. But that also means we have to deal with about 100 different packages and APIs and all sorts of variances between what Debian and Ubuntu think is right, even different versions. I mean, it's pretty wild. So we have a super aggressive continuous integration on in our project. And this is a life and death thing for us. And if you go and you open a pull request, even a simple one that fixes a typo, it will literally be tested across 10 different operating systems, 3 different browsers, different architectures, and all of this to make sure that you didn't break something. And this ends up booting per day, something like between 10, 20, 30,000 operating systems each day to test the changes that people contribute. And this is what makes it work at its core. These kinds of things would be untenable. The kind of stuff we pull off would be untenable without this.
And how scalable is this? I mean, how many systems is this? It seems like this is a tool that's meant for Linux system administrators. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what it seems like it's geared towards. So, if I've got, I don't know, let's say 500 hosts, and I need to make a particular change on all of them, is this a tool that can help me with that? Can I monitor more than one system at a time? How do I guess get over that hump? Because that's where the real challenge becomes, even for experienced Linux administrators, is, I can do this on one system fine, but I don't want to have to go out and do it 100 times or 500 times on all of my servers that need this security patch or tweak to some file or something. So is this tool going to get, or maybe it's already there? I don't know. You tell me.
So we don't want to replace things like Puppet or Ansible and reinvent that. There's many people competing in that, many projects competing well in that area, and many projects that have died. Like the field is littered with people who have tried to reinvent this and lost. What Cockpit is for is, in the case where you have tons of systems, is to be able to zero in on the systems that are causing you trouble, to troubleshoot them, to diagnose them, to change them, to discover what's wrong with them. A lot of people treat such systems as cattle, but even a cattle farmer will not go out when they see one of their cattle sick or having a problem and just shoot them and get rid of them. They will try and figure out what happened there so that they can then apply that knowledge to the rest of the herd. And this is very similar to what you would do with Cockpit in a large setup and installation with very many homogeneous systems like that. You would apply diagnosis and then use Ansible, use Puppet, use Salt, or something else to then scale out that knowledge of configuration across all of the systems. And that ties into the idea of what that question about Project Atomic. Base functionality of Cockpit is available in every Project Atomic system. Now, these are container hosts that are meant to be deployed at scale. And this base functionality is accessible over SSH. You log into a single instance of Cockpit with your browser, maybe even on your local laptop. And you add the other system that you want to diagnose, and it'll connect out over SSH and provide you the exact same experience as if it was listening on port 9090, as if you were connected directly with your browser to it. And this allows that model, it's really a bastion host model, to work very well, where you connect to one system and it connects out to the 1 or 2 or 5 that you're interested in. But you can hear the story here. We're connecting out with SSH, 500 SSH connections, 1,000 SSH connections at the same time. That's not, it doesn't really work that well. And that's not what it's meant for. There is more. We have a Kubernetes dashboard that lets you then look at what Kubernetes view of the world, the cluster view of the world, or an OpenShift view of the world, which is a distribution of Kubernetes that Red Hat supports. And with that, you can dive into what your application is doing across all those hosts, what the containers are doing, no matter where they are. You can go and find out what is connected to what. There's cool visualizations of this. There are ways to dive into the containers on those on the various nodes and look at the logs and so on. So lots of answers there. I hope one of them fits for the viewer to try this out, and give us feedback if parts of those stories are not complete.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, are you working at all with some of the well, certainly I would think Red Hat and Ubuntu. Are you working with them to try to drive Cockpit into the system preferences panel as an option? Like, do you foresee this as becoming like a default tool that lives, and it's like, oh, you want to, maybe this becomes the something in the administration GUI or something that's like, oh, launch Cockpit to administer your system or to set something up. I mean, because I agree with your premise that people have been trying this for forever. I mean, since the inception of the Linux desktop, especially, to try to get some sort of easy to use administration tool. And it sounds like this is doing administration and monitoring, which is great. But I mean, is that where this is headed? Or do you think, is that the goal? Or do you think it will always be kind of a side project that, as part of people's, when they roll it out, they include that package as part of their install?
We have. So Fedora Server, which is often a place where a lot of the Red Hat ideas get tested and tried out, includes Cockpit by default. You log in, it'll actually print out the URL on the VT that you would connect to log in. So that's where we'd like to be with a lot of places. And as we noted earlier, Project Atomic integrates this in a way that makes sense for a containerized host. So those are places where I consider it's on by default. And yes, one of the mantras we have is use it to configure, don't configure to use it. We want it to be out of the box usable in order to meet that first goal. And so we are pushing hard on those things. That's why we're so we worked so hard on making it tiny, having written in C code on the server with very, very minor dependencies, making it work with the system and not changing your system in a fundamental way. These were all the prerequisites to having it installed by default and usable by default. And in the cases where we've tried, we've made that happen already, and we want to make it happen more. And so if there's anyone listening who wants to make this part of your deployment, wants to make it part of your distro, or part of your gold image, then by all means, ping us. And if there's pieces missing, we can help finish them.
I love that attitude. I had another question, and it was also asked in the chat by Emily the Strange, because you mentioned, I think, Puppet and Ansible before, which is something you're not going after. You're not trying to take those, take on that kind of a tool set. But do you plug into those tools? In other words, do you have integration to those tools so that if I find something on a single host, I go in and I do that troubleshooting, as you mentioned, and I say, oh, there's this one particular configuration change that needs to be made. Can I then plug that into Puppet or Ansible and say, okay, now go deploy this to this given set of hosts in my environment?
No, that's a really great question. And it's unfortunately not something that we have integrated for all of the features that we've deployed today. There are new features, such as make my server be an IDM server, an authentication server, or make my server be a web server. These are features that are coming into Cockpit. So they're sort of the give a server role to my server features with configuration, or an NFS server, and so on. And with these, we have definitely said, look, we'd like to export that configuration via Ansible. Those will be the first places that we're going to do this. So this feature, that functionality is on the roadmap. But unfortunately, we haven't done it for everything that's there yet. One place we have integrated is there's a lot of managers of clusters. So there's CloudForms or ManageIQ. There's things like Spacewalk. There's a Satellite. There's what else is there? There's Overt for managing all the virtual machines across a large cluster. And in these UIs, you'll start. Some of them already ship this, but you'll start to see a web console next to the listing of hosts. So when they're dealing with a whole bunch of hosts, you can then dive into one, go into the specifics of that host, and that will be Cockpit showing up there. So that's another integration angle that's happening right now.
Cool. And how does that integration happen? I don't want to hog the time, because I want to talk about the GUI. The GUI looks cool. It looks like maybe you're using some Node.js in here. I know Randall probably wants to get to the specific language and programming stuff, but I'm just kind of curious, as far as the integrations go, have you developed a kind of a plugin or integration methodology? Like if I wanted to write a plugin to my thing and have Cockpit be able to manage my other thing, my MySQL database or my whatever it is that done via an SDK or an API, or is it, how easy is it to write a plugin for Cockpit?
It is so easy. It's amazing. I literally will talk to people, and on stage with people, hundreds people there, will write one of these plugins in 5 minutes. 5 minutes is all it takes to write, for example, a plugin that will export NFS shares and to other hosts. I mean, that's how simple this is. So there's tutorials, again, at that link, cockpitproject.org. There's tutorials links, there's developer API links, so on. And it is really trivial to get started. I will come out and say it's as easy to build a piece of UI as it is to write a shell script.
Well, Aaron led me into this next question, which is, so what is this written in? It sounds like you've got some JavaScript stuff going on the client side, obviously. What frameworks are you using there, and why? And what's actually happening on server side?
So on the client side, we talked about this a little bit earlier, where it's different apps, different single-page apps running. And these run as separate documents in the browser, using the browser's frames, essentially, to separate them. And some of them are written in React, some are in Angular. The JavaScript topology and landscape changes every 3 weeks. So we came up with an architecture and design that doesn't mean we have to rewrite all of Cockpit every time this happens. Different pieces of Cockpit, depending on when they were written, are written with different frameworks. Some of them are even written in jQuery. Old stuff, some of them are written in very new stuff in ES6 or React with JSX, or even I've seen stuff in Angular 2 being written. And it works with all of these different things. And that's one of those architectural choices we made really early on, and it has paid off amazingly. On the server side, we have some small components that allow the JavaScript to communicate with the server. There's a piece called the bridge, which runs as the user and essentially doesn't know anything about system administration. Really, really nothing. Well, all it knows how to do is, when I receive this command from the front end, I know that I should execute this command and pipe the output back, or this bridge should connect to this Unix socket, or should connect to this dbus API and send this message. And what this allows you to do is have most of the logic in the browser, and a very small pieces on the server, written in C, without any, without the overhead that typical web application might have.
So the server side, the bridge is in C.
That's right. And between the two, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what about the plugins then? Where do they live? Do they live as pieces of JavaScript, or do they live as something that the bridge can call? Where does it fit in the picture?
Yeah, so similar. We do need to load the applications into the browser, and it traverses the bridge. So you put them in certain directories, and you can have user-specific apps. You can have system-installed apps. They're in these directories in user share cockpit. Really simple, small little manifest that tells it about them. And there's HTML and JavaScript and CSS there, as you would expect. So all of the system is if you're interested, is at the developer guide at that link, cockpitproject.org. Mm-hmm. And it's trivial to get started. We have several tutorials that will get you started within a few minutes.
I noticed you mentioned systemd at least once or twice in here, but that's not on every system that's out there that calls itself Linux. Is there a requirement that it have systemd?
So technically, no. Technically, all the basic functionality, the enablers, the session, and so on, the enablers of Cockpit could work without systemd. However, systemd went and integrated a significant part of the system. So a lot of the functionality that you'll see does have some dependency on systemd. A lot of the stuff in the UI will need systemd to be there. And in fact, no one has yet done the work to disentangle that. It's possible. Basic architecture allows for that, but no one has invested the time for that yet.
Okay, so what distributions does this not work with, like the older Ubuntus and older Debians?
That's right. So older, I believe, Debian 7, it doesn't work. It doesn't work with Ubuntu 1404, like from 2014, that time frame. It works on 1604, the LTS release, and later. What else? It doesn't work on RHEL 6 or CentOS 6. That's something that might be interesting to work on, but like I said, so far that hasn't been something that we've done, or no one has contributed that. What else? I know it does work on Arch. There's packages there that are maintained very regularly. I have not seen packages for Gentoo. Probably older versions of SUSE, although the newer ones, definitely it works there.
Okay, well, you just named a whole bunch of releases, and I'm not a Linux guy, so I hope that made sense to our audience. But the one thing I did hear actually made me disappointed. I was really excited for the first half of the show, and all of a sudden you said it doesn't work with 1404, and I know that's the flavor that my primary client is using in the cloud. So I was going all of a sudden, finally, I don't have to learn all those stupid Linux commands for administration. I can just do a nice GUI. I guess we'll have to wait till they upgrade to 1604 then, or whatever the next one's going to be. So that's disappointing.
If there's enough interest, there's nothing that prevents that from happening, but it is work. And systemd did a lot of that work for us. And therefore, we were able to sort of make this happen.
Well, so who's working on this? You, obviously or we wouldn't have you on the show. But is it a small team, big team, mostly Red Hat people? Mostly, is there a community yet that's contributing changes?
There is a community. So there's a channel on IRC, on Freenode IRC #Cockpit. That's fairly active. Mm-hmm. There's a team of 6 or 7 people working at Red Hat on this. Then we have, from projects that are interested in building UI this way, within Cockpit, there's people who come by and contribute stuff. There's a fairly active community of translators. One of the really cool things that we do is we release every week. Not every release goes everywhere, but because of our continuous integration, and we have continuous delivery as well, we release this every week. So if you come by and contribute a change, add something or fix something, the next week there will be a release out, and that release goes into Fedora at very minimum every week, and there will be builds for Ubuntu, for Debian. There's every 6 weeks you'll see updates that go out into RHEL. It's a very active process that's happening here. So I hope that it is interesting to people.
And let's talk about that a little bit, because it sounds like the design of your continuous integration system has to allow for many, many, many different flavors of Linux to test this with. How is that actually architected? Are you running them inside containers as you spin them up, or do you have like dedicated machines with each one of the OS releases on it?
This is I could go on and on about this for a long time, so I'm going to have to cut it a bit short. But essentially, we found that we end up having what amounts to team members written as automation, as bots. And what they do is they do run in containers. They stage in containers. They have what they need there. And we end up running VMs inside of containers. And these bots will choose tasks to do. Typically, they do testing. They do integration. So that's most of their work. They'll have different images. We have base images that get updated weekly from different operating systems that then we layer someone's change on top of. So someone makes a change for a typo or pull request, that change gets layered on top, and the tests run against it. But the bots themselves will go and update those images, go out, find the new updates, and propose those as changes in the project. Or the bots will go out and find upgrades for different JavaScript dependencies, or they'll go out and find translations that have been done, and they'll submit pull requests to the project itself. And this has gone on so much so that the 5th highest contributor to Cockpit are these bots. They do the drudge and dreary work that we all normally would have to share in a project, and they take it on and do it. Now, if you look at the work independently, you'll be like, oh, that's crap. And it's true. But without them, everyone would have to do it. So it's pretty amazing how this works. But I'll cut myself off there. Oh, and we do run in containers, in OpenShift, in Kubernetes. We can scale these bots up and down. They're pretty autonomous and independent. They'll actually do that thing. When you bump into someone in the hall, if two people are trying to go the same way, one person will go left, the other person will go right. They'll try and figure out a way around each other and figure, okay, you go. And they have these kind of autonomous and randomizing capabilities, and there's no single authority that coordinates them. They just run from the code, and as changes are made, even to the bots, they'll run those changes. One of the bots will say, I'm going to run these changes that someone made to this task or these bots and figure out if it works. And if it does, and that change gets merged, all the bots will start to behave that way. So it's really organic and very amazing when you step back and take a look how they work.
Well, now this sounds like something that should be spun off as a separate project. Is it possible to do that? Sounds like you created something really remarkable.
So the answer is yes and no, which is unfortunate, because I wish it was yes and yes. So yes, in the sense that many of the tasks that the bots do, other projects do use. So the fact that they can go and update a spec file with a change log and commit it and build it and sign it and go off and push it into a distro, other people are starting to use that code. And that's great. That helps everyone. What is hard to move to another project is the fact that these bots are changed by all the people, the contributors on the team, constantly. It's a very organic thing. Just like if you had a new team member join your team, you're teaching them, hey, this is how we do things. And then next week when something changes, you teach the intern or whoever comes in, no, actually now we're going to do it differently. So these bots are under constant change. And what we've done, the fundamental cool part that we've done is enable that rate of change to these bots. They don't rot because people can change them. But that also means if another project clones these bots, which we have the technology to do that. It's called copy, right? CP. They have to care about those bots in the same way and enable that. Essentially, they're part of the team and train them as things change. And if they do, that's great. It'll work for them. The bots will diverge in their case. The clone will diverge. If they don't, they'll rot and freeze and be done and won't get any of the benefit. So that's why it's a yes and no answer. And I haven't come up with a way to change that.
Okay, so that sounds fascinating.
Go ahead.
Aaron. Oh, you go ahead.
I just want to ask a couple follow-up questions because this is obviously something that's built with Docker in mind. And so as you were kind of explaining some of the things you can do, I got to wondering something that we deal with here at New Relic. In fact, I was just talking to one of our engineers about this problem yesterday, which is, when you're running in a container, you don't necessarily have all the access you need to the underlying host resources, right, to be able to see those, administer those. So I'm just kind of curious what the functionality is when you're running in a container versus running on the underlying OS. And do you need to be installed on both or running on both? Can you kind of explain how that works?
Right. So were you asking about the tests and the bots or about Cockpit itself?
I was thinking about Cockpit itself.
Okay. So typically, Cockpit will run on the host. That's the typical way to install it. You apt-get install Cockpit, and it runs. Or you yum install it, and it runs. On projects like in Project Atomic, we'll have certain portions in the host, the bridge, and we'll have the thing that listens on the network, which is called the Cockpit Web Service, as an optional container. It's not on every host, but you can install it and run it. And what that will actually do is you're absolutely right. The bridge needs access to the host. It needs access to the various services on the host. It needs access to the kernel. It needs access to the file system, all sorts of stuff. It needs to be run as if you were logged into the host. When you log into the host, you don't SSH into a container directly. You SSH into the host. And then if you want to perform a task in a container, obviously, that's what you do. That's exactly how Cockpit needs to be run and expects to be run. And so when you're running parts of Cockpit in a container, the part that, for example, listens on the network, the optional part, it will actually SSH into the host for you and start the bridge on the host. So your user session, your login session is actually running on the host and has all the access that it needs to the host as your credentials, as your login. There's also some distributions of Cockpit, for example, that take certain features of Cockpit, the Kubernetes dashboard, for example, and wrap that in a container. Or the image registry functionality for Docker images, wrap that in a container. And with only that, then they don't need access to the host. They're accessing an API or something else that is provided into the container. But those are the exception rather than the rule.
Cool. And that brings me to my next question, which is around security. So how do you handle security? I mean, I know that you can I was just looking, you can click on open a terminal session right in the browser. And I'm kind of curious what you're using for the terminal part of that, like if you're using another open source project to make that happen. But that's a side question, I guess. But more importantly, to me, that raises a potential security issue. So do you integrate with LDAP or SSO tools in order to make sure that the right people have, either have or don't have access? And then I guess a third question, it's all about security, is how do you escalate? And this comes from the chat room from Commodore Crunch. How does Cockpit go about escalating privileges as needed? So if I need root privileges to run a command, how does that happen? So I guess there's three questions there. Sorry to throw them all at you at once, but they all relate to security.
No, that's great. And I just wrote a blog post on my blog, steph.thewalter.net, exactly about this topic that goes into the details here. So it's fresh on my mind. And we did want to, originally we imagined, we can do better than Linux security. And it turns out when you try to do that, you end up, it's like a house of cards that collapses under you and you have to reinvent everything. So we stood back true to the original principle. That is to say, we don't have user data. We don't have extra privileges. No part of Cockpit has any extra privileges than you with your credentials when you log in. So first of all, the pieces of Cockpit listening on the network, well, those are, there could be vulnerabilities there. In fact, we want to find those. But those pieces listen with they run with unprivileged user with SE Linux and AppArmor in effect that lock it down so it can barely do anything. So that part doesn't have root access. So then once you log in with your credentials, we use PAM or GSS API to authenticate. GSS API is a single sign-on. If you have a Kerberos ticket inside of a domain, or either a Windows domain, it works with Windows domains, or like an IPA domain, it will, an AD domain for Windows, of course, and IPA for Linux, more of a Linux system, it will allow you to then log in. And we work with almost any PAM module that has text input and output. So if you've enabled PAM authentication for shell logins, it's trivial to do the same for Cockpit. In the PAM stack, you would just copy that configuration over, and it will work great there. So the PAM, there's a small piece of code that does that PAM authentication. That has to run as root. That's the way it is. So that part runs as root, and then it will spawn the bridge as your user. And the part that's running as your user really doesn't have access to anything further. Now, but that doesn't work for most people. I mean, you could log in as root, and then the bridge would have great access to the system, be able to do all sorts of things. Most people who want to do system administration, they log in as themselves. That's the best practice. And then they use sudo to escalate privileges. Or there's some components use polkit to be able to do that, also known as PolicyKit. But they're two technologies that sort of have an analog. They're at that same level of escalating privileges once you're logged in. And Cockpit can use either one. So you'll notice on the login screen, there's a checkbox that says, reuse my password to perform privileged tasks. And if you check that, what will happen is after login, whenever Cockpit needs to sudo, it will try. And if it needs a password, it will use that password, or polkit, it will use that password to essentially prevent you from having to type in the password again. And that then, for certain tasks, will escalate to super user to be able to perform that task. There's a little lock icon at the top. You can, of course, lock it and kill that at any point in time and go back to your unprivileged or kill all uses of those credentials and so on. But we use the same standard tools and subsystems to escalate privileges to authenticate, as you would imagine. There's no magic here. We've just made it easier and integrated it.
Hey, we're almost out of time. Man, we could probably keep going on another 20, 30 minutes before we started even thinking about looking at the list of questions you sent us. But there is something I want to ask before we let you go, and that is what's on the roadmap? What's still missing that would make this a more integrated system or more useful system than what you already have? And is it usable already as it is?
So it's definitely usable already as it is. We get lots of feedback on that. In the container area, in the Kubernetes area, in the storage, network configuration area, people use this all the time. In fact, you'll go to conferences sometimes and you'll see people doing stuff with Cockpit. And that's really cool to see that going on. Mm-hmm. What's on the roadmap? I think that Cockpit has been focused on, in many cases, on configuring the server or the system. So configuring the containers on it, configuring the networking, storage, logs, and so on. What we'd like to do is start to enable configuration of, or diagnosis or deployment of the things that the server is there to do. I mean, a server is not an inert thing just there to do networking or storage. You've deployed it for a reason. And so that's what we want to start to make happen. And so you'll see that right now there's even some open initial pull requests on making those server apps, such as bringing up a domain, authentication domain that works with LDAP and Kerberos, or bringing up a NFS server, or bringing up a, I'm not going to say web server because that's a scary one. It can do all sorts of stuff, or Postgres server and so on, and making those things work. And of course, you can imagine that links in with containers, that links in with containerized deployments and so on as the best practice way to implement that. But that's on the roadmap. And then a lot of integration points, a lot of finishing things. When on Linux, you used to have GTK-based tooling for things that were really server use cases, like Virt Manager. That's a great tool, especially. But when you have to use it on a server and you have to install X and everything to get it up and running, well, you really should be able to do that in Cockpit. And so that's another thing that's on the roadmap. There's lots of work to be done that just got merged with software updates, package installation, and so on. That's coming along. I could go on, but I hope that gives you a taste.
And I presume we've got internationalization and that sort of thing to worry about as well. So there's probably some languages that can be contributed, right?
That's right. There's language. People are actively translating Cockpit already. There's language selection in there. In fact, I think Japanese recently reached 100% translation, so that's great. And Chinese is up on the list too, Ukrainian. But many of the other languages lack complete translation. So the place to go for that is Fedora Zanata. Type that in Google and it'll take you to the right place. And if you're interested, we pull that again every week. You'll see your translations there really quickly.
Cool. And again, like I said, we're almost out of time. Is there anything we didn't ask you that you want to make sure our audience is aware of before we have to let you go?
I think you touched on it. The reason that we're not like Webmin, that Cockpit is not like Webmin, and Cockpit is not like cPanel, is that it doesn't take over your server. It really doesn't want to force you to do things in the Cockpit way or lock you into Cockpit. You can outgrow Cockpit at any time and then jump back for that one task that you didn't want to have to learn to do another way. That's fine. You can do Cockpit tasks with your other server tasks, with your scripts, with your existing Ansible playbooks at the same time. If an Ansible playbook comes and drives by and touches your system while Cockpit's logged in, you'll see the changes in Cockpit. This is not a lock-in system. This is to enable you to grow and learn and expand Linux, not to hold you in here. In fact, when you log into Cockpit, when you bring it up, you won't see Cockpit anywhere but the About dialog. If you do, it's a bug. You'll see Fedora. You'll see Debian. You'll see Ubuntu on the screen. You'll see that. It's about your system. It's about displaying your system in a visual way in a browser.
Okay, and two final questions. That's a great answer, by the way. Two final questions before I let you go, or else my audience yells at me. What's your favorite scripting language?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Sorry, I don't have an answer there. I mean, Python is a big one for me, but they all have sports.
Well, it's probably not going to be Perl. I can probably already tell you that, but you're too young to like Perl. Yeah. And what's your text editor? What favorite text editor do you have?
Oh, Vim all the way. You should look in the content log.
I am just never going to get a Perl Emacs combo. Well, I had one, I guess, about 6 weeks ago. That was kind of nice, but it's finally somebody said that. So, hey, it's been great having you on talking about Cockpit. I know a lot of people are going to say, oh my God, I've been looking for something exactly like this, and they're going to be downloading it right after hearing the show. Unless you're driving, don't do it while you're driving, okay? Go home first. Go home, and then download it. That'll be much better. Anyway, thanks, Steph, for coming on the show and talking about Cockpit.
Thanks for having me on. This has been great, and this has been fun.
Very good. Well, fun we always like to hear. That was Steph Walter talking to us about Cockpit. What do you think, Aaron?
This is really cool. Like we said multiple times, I think towards the beginning, this is a tool that's really needed. And it has kind of been one of those areas that everyone is trying to solve, and they just don't do it well enough to make something stick. So I guess I wish them well. I hope that this does stick. I was just looking up the documentation on how to write a plugin. I mean, it looks like they're doing a good job with documentation and making this easy to use and all the stuff they need to do to make it successful, and integrating with some of the newer technologies like the Docker technologies and Kubernetes that people are, all the cool kids are using these days. So I think they're on the right track. I wish I was on my Linux partition on this laptop and not forced to use the OS X partition, because I wanted to try this and I couldn't because I was like, man, OS X, this sucks. But I'm going to go try it. I'd be interested to see how it runs on Raspberry Pi. Not that you'd really need it there, but just kind of cool to try it out, see if it works there. And I think this project probably has a pretty good future. I would definitely recommend people that are in the system administration business as part of their day job, or even part of their hobby, to go check it out and take a look. I know I'm going to look at it as soon as I reboot my laptop.
I'm going to look at it too, but it'll probably have to be within some Docker container and to administer the pieces of the stuff inside the Docker container. But that'd be a good way for me to play with it as well. And maybe eventually when when my primary client ZipRecruiter gets updated a little bit to the latest releases of Ubuntu, that might be a little bit better. But this is great. This is the kind of thing that I love having on this show, to be able to expose this to a much greater audience. And if it solves problems for you, my goodness, use it, and hey, it's not like the price is a problem, right? It's free in all senses of the word. So anyway, we're running out of time, so I should probably do the rundown of the upcoming guests. Next week, we have Redis, the most popular in-memory key-value store. I can't believe we haven't had him on the show yet, but somebody reminded me that I hadn't, and so I talked to the guys, and we got him. Brian Bellendorf is going to come and talk about Hyperledger, which is blockchain technology, like think Bitcoin, but for everything, for anything you have to do in public as a public ledger. Jenkins, which is the leading CI/CD server. You can, let's see, so that's for cross-platform. You can deploy and manage containers. All Things Open, we're going to bring them on. All Things Open is a show on the East Coast coming up in October, and we're in fact are going to have the hosts from that show, the people putting that together, are going to come talk to us. LibreOffice, again, another update after 5 years. We haven't had them for 5 years. A lot of things have happened to them. Kazoo, also an update for them. Cloud telephony. That's going to be a fun show as well. So we're going to talk about that. Hiawatha Web Server, which is a security-focused web server. Just added to the schedule between last week and this week, Aquameta. I don't quite understand it from the website, so their elevator pitch needs a little bit of speaking, but they label themselves as a web development environment designed around datafication using Postgres. It seemed like it was very meta, and that's probably why they call it Aquameta, because it's really, you're changing the Postgres things that change the way the Postgres interaction happens or the way things interact on the screen. Really sort of cool, but they're coming on. All these are actually back-to-back shows, except for next week. We're taking next week off. And then also later towards the end of the year, we have Crail, which is high performance storage and networking. Probably get you back for that one because it's about storage. If you can see everybody on the show, you can see everybody on the show. You can see the people we have lined up by going to the spreadsheet for the show, twit.tv/floss. If you have any other suggestions, please tell the project leader or the community coordinator to email me. We have a live stream. We took some questions from it today. Thank you, people in the live stream at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays now. We have moved to our new permanent slot on Wednesdays. You can see that at live.twit.tv. You can follow us at Floss Weekly on Google+, and also at Floss Weekly on Twitter. You can follow me at Randall L. Schwartz on Google+, and at Merlin on Twitter. I'm going to be at DragonCon in September, doing actually a 1-hour talk on why Dart should be your next programming language. And I'm also going to be, again, also at allthingsopen.org, which is the conference coming up in October. I hear we're going to have some discounts for attendees for All Things Open when we bring on the producers. Anything you want to plug there, Aaron?
Yeah. So you can always find me on all the social networks. I'm Aaron Newcomb on pretty much all of them. I actually have an Instagram account. That's what they call it, right? Instagram or something like that.
Instagram.
Oh, Instagram. Oh. Yeah, yes, I always tease my kids with that. I try to act like the old guy. Anyway, I have an Instagram account as well. You can follow me, look at all my pretty pictures. But beyond that, you could also check out my book. Linux for Makers, which is available wherever books are sold, including Amazon. So go grab a copy today if you're interested in maybe you don't know as much about Linux as you would like, and you also consider yourself a maker. This would be a good primer to kind of get you started. You won't get a job as a sysadmin or anything like that, but it'll at least show you how to use Linux to get your projects done. And also, I should just give a shout out to my employer, New Relic, which allows me to take a little bit of time out of my busy schedule to come do this show. So thank you to them for that. And you can always go to newrelic.com and check out all of our great monitoring applications that we make for applications and infrastructure. So that's my plugs.
And I can already hear there's going to be an update to your book that has a whole chapter on Cockpit, right? That was so funny. It made me almost lose it there. Actually, a lot of people are suggesting like, oh, you could add this. Oh, you could add this. So, I am planning another version or revision anyway, and I'll just have to check with my publisher and see if they'll let me add any pages. That's the challenge is, will you let me make the book bigger? Because then it costs more, obviously, to produce, but we'll see. Sure. Good. And Aaron, it's good to see you back again on the show. So, and I imagine now that you don't have the continual schedule conflict, you'll be available even more often. So I look forward to that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, good to be back. Feels like coming back home. Indeed. And so thank you all out there in the studio audience. Wait, we don't have a studio audience. We have our audience. They're not in studio anywhere. They are not here in my home. Neither am I. So we'll see you all again next week on FLOSS Weekly.